Welcome back to this second session. My name is Andrea Cellino. I represent a young institute, which is the Middle East Institute Switzerland, MAIS, and I just would like to start by thanking the NATO Foundation for this opportunity to cooperate in this important event. Our panel is going to address the role of NATO more specifically, and we have two NATO officials present, and in particular the role of NATO in both relations with the African Union and energy security. The first panel breached the global picture and gave us an idea about the challenges in terms of energy and the challenges about development across the African continent. Some hints at what could be or could not be the role of NATO have already been made, and I want to go more into the specifics. And with regard to the two main topics, main issues, relations with the African Union and energy security, NATO has a long-standing engagement in energy security since the Bucharest Summit in 2008, when the issue was taken on. Still, it remains a role which is mainly, because there's something more, about supporting member countries protecting their security, their energy infrastructure. In terms of cooperation with the African Union, NATO signed in 2019 an agreement of cooperation with the African Union, which is, I quote, gradual and pragmatic, meaning that it focuses on operational support, training support, and little less. So neither is a priority for the alliance and on the alliance agenda. We all know what the priority and priorities are at the moment for the alliance. And so looking at the shift that has been occurring in energy security on the one hand, because now we are looking south in terms of energy security rather than east, and in terms of relations or the opposition to Russia's role, we shouldn't forget that in recent months and years, Russia has been adopting a very aggressive policy in the African continent, particularly in North Africa, but also in the Sahel. You just need to read the newspapers to see how Russia is increasingly providing military support or mercenary support through various configurations of what we call Wagner, and now it's called in different ways. And so, in light of all of this, is there really something that that NATO can do in terms of security to provide increased security according to its mandate, by increasing its role and its cooperation with the African Union? And as has been hinted in the previous session, could NATO provide an example or a model for collective cooperation to the African countries? And thirdly, as we have heard very clearly that the main challenge for the continent is economic, is development, not only in the energy sector, of course, these are not things that, this is not something that belongs as a responsibility to NATO, but NATO has a long-standing cooperation with the European Union, and so is there something that NATO, together with the European Union, could do in this sense, always keeping in mind both the geopolitical priorities and the security, the energy security challenges. I will start with Mr. Julian Wieczorkiewicz. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly.
Very impressive.
who is a policy officer for climate change and security section at NATO headquarters in Brussels. He is an energy security analyst, and he's a very diverse background in diplomatic and policy, including with the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to start by thanking the NATO Foundation for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, also on a personal level. In fact, I would like to rebound on the comments made by Mr. Mistretta this morning, because I also consider myself partially African. I spent 9 years of my life in Morocco, 1 in Tunisia, and 1 in Algeria. So I know the Maghreb as my back pocket. Now, what I will discuss today is NATO's role in energy security, because I was kind of asked by the organizers to provide you with a holistic picture, strategic picture, before jumping into details. So, as said, my name is Julian. I work at NATO HQ, dealing with energy at the climate and energy security section. And usually, when I meet people, people are like, so what do you do? And the answer is simple. NATO is not a EU member state. NATO is not the EU, so we don't legislate. We don't do policy. We are a security organization and military alliance. So everything that we do related to energy specifically at NATO HQ will look through the security lenses. Okay? So this is a very important element to keep in mind. And currently, there are 2 issues that are extremely high on our agenda. The first one is obviously Ukraine, and the second one is the energy transition. Why Ukraine? Because for the past 18 months, Russia has been trying to win the war in Ukraine by destroying the Ukrainian power system. What does it mean for a country to live without electricity? You can imagine. Try to walk 10 blocks of stairs, 10 floors up, and try to cook something if you have an electric kitchen. Good luck with that. Try to find some food downtown, good luck with that. Try to go to your office to work, good luck with that. Secondly, the energy transition, why? Because it's accelerating, it's happening. The direction of travel is crystal clear, and at some point in time, it will affect our military forces. And what we're trying to do at NATO HQ is trying to make that impact as smooth as possible. May I have the next slide, please? As said, the energy transition is accelerating drastically, and there are 3 fundamental reasons behind it. The list is not exhaustive. You could add more easily, but I picked 3. First of all, climate policies. This was already discussed, so I will not dive into that for the interest of time. But indeed, they were in place for quite some time now. They're getting more ambitious, and this affects the energy mix across the Euro-Atlantic area. Secondly, and I would like to discuss this a little bit, is Russia's actions. Why Russia's actions are accelerating the energy transition? Well, first of all, it was also already said, Russia weaponized energy supplies against the collective West. NATO, the EU, call it the way you want it. And it all started back in 2021, and over the summer of 2021. Why then? Because what we have in Europe over the summer, we have gas storage sites, which we fill during the summer, and we take gas from those storage sites gradually over the winter time when the demand for that gas is high up. What happened in the summer of 2021, Russia decreased gas levels in its storage sites across Europe because it used to own them. So that was the beginning, kind of the crisis. And that slowly started to push gas prices in Europe up. The second wave came when the invasion started, Russia's war of aggression. Basically, Gazprom started to cut off gas supplies to Europe under various pretexts. Countries refused to settle in rubles. Some countries were declared as unfriendly states. And that further pushed prices in Europe up to 175 euros per megawatt hour in the spring of 2022, which is very expensive. Today we're at like 50, to put things into perspective. And then the Nord Stream event happened. I don't know who did it. I don't have a crystal ball. But I agree with President Putin. When he spoke to Tucker Carlson, he said that when those kinds of events happen, you need to think who has an interest to do it and who has the means to do it. I don't know who did it. I know that Russia has the means to do it. If it benefited Russia, I'll let you to judge. But what it did, that event, it further led to a further increase of gas prices in Europe to 350 megawatts per hour over the winter of 2022, which was crazy expensive. So how did we react? And obviously, Yemen, basically heat points all over the globe, Yemen, the Middle East, but also climate events such as El Nino, all of those things, they very much affect energy flows across the globe, making markets much more volatile. And those events, especially the second one, so Russia's policies, triggered policy responses across the EU, across NATO. What did we do? Well, Mr. Latella already addressed this morning. We deployed renewables, we decreased gas consumption, we deployed heat pumps, and this is clearly the direction of travel. If you don't believe me, look at the numbers. For $1 invested in the oil industry, $1 is invested by the private sector in photovoltaics. If you add to the list wind and nuclear, it's $1 to 1.7. So it's clear where we're going, and there's no way back. There is no coming back. This is where it's headed. And why I'm mentioning this? Because part of our response was to try to replace the volumes that Russia used to sell us. 150 billion cubic meters. This gas traveled from Russia to Europe by pipelines. Today, this gas is not traveling at the same amount, it's down to 20 BCM. Gas is basically being flared up somewhere in Russia. Not great for climate. Climate change will massively affect Africa. And not bad for, and not good for the African economy and the African energy sector. Why? Because when we rushed for this gas, we were competing with other buyers across the globe. And unfortunately, those with the thickest wallet won. So basically, all to sum up, the energy transition is accelerating massively. It will lead to drastic changes across the globe, and Africa will not be immune to it. I'll end here.
Thank you very much. I think there are some issues that remain open. It's very good that you mentioned Yemen and MENA, and I certainly will come back to those points that you made in terms of the shift that I mentioned in the beginning in terms of energy security from the east, which you very well described, to the south. Now, talking about the south, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Andrea Grazioso, who is precisely working as a senior analyst in the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub. Perhaps you should briefly say what is the purpose of this South Hub. He's an economist with a wide experience in the academic and think tank world. And he's also been a civil servant in the Italian Ministry of Defense. Andrea, up to you to address the South.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting the Hub to this important and timely discussion. As for the Hub, well, it's one of the main deliverable generated by this political decision of NATO back in 2016, actually, to significantly reinforce the engagement with the southern world, with the southern neighborhood. And in the wider framework for the South, the Hub was established in order to create a bridge between NATO as an organization and our friends and partners in the South, in order to, let's say, reinforce the understanding of the South and Southern issues in the context of NATO political debate, and at the same time, in order to convey the proper messages to our friends and partners in the South about what actually NATO is. That is to say, a political alliance dealing with shared security in our wider common region, including north and south and east of the Mediterranean. But I have been asked to address specifically the relationship between NATO and the African Union, which actually is almost 20 years old, because it was established actually in 2005. It is important to know that the same African Union is not very much older, because it was established just 2002. From the very beginning, this support was defined by three overarching principles. That is to say, African ownership, at African Union request, and in coordination with other international organizations. So this NATO support was originally triggered by the request from African Union to force logistic support in order to support African Union-led operations, peacekeeping operation in Africa. Over the time, this cooperation has evolved. In 2014, NATO established a NATO liaison office in Addis Ababa at the African Union headquarters in order to expand this cooperation. And since then, there are different strands of work, including military-to-military talks, including the persistent, enduring, I would say, logistic support to African Union-led peacekeeping operation, but there is also a training and education program where we have African officers attending NATO schools, specifically NATO schools in Oberammergau, Germany. And there is also a structural, systemic, let's say, support in order to support the let's say, staff capabilities of the African Union, providing their staff with specific training in terms of early warning and in terms of improved readiness for the Africa Standby Force, which is another important element, another important objective. I wish to mention also an additional strand of work where the Southern Hub is directly involved, because we are regularly working with the Africa Center for Study and Research on Terrorism, which is a unit part of the African Union dealing specifically with terrorism. Now, how can we do that? Because every year we have a joint activity with them, dealing with terrorism in Sahel, terrorism in other parts of Africa, etc. How can we do that? Because it's important to remember that there is no security agreement between NATO and the African Union, so we cannot exchange classified information. We can do that because the hub is not part of the Intel community. So we are the perfect bridge between NATO and the Southern Neighborhood exactly for this reason, because we can discuss and deal with our friends and partners about this very critical topic without touching, let's say, sensibilities and sensitivities as far as securities are concerned. Now, I used the term cooperation instead of support. The original term was support because, as I said, there is a progress in this discussion. The role of the liaison office in Addis Ababa, of course, is crucial, is pivotal. Everybody trying to assess the relevance, the depth and width of the cooperation between the African Union and NATO is looking at this office. This is understandable. I mean, every tourist entering the Sistina Chapel stare at the Michelangelo's fresco with the two fingers almost touching, you know, moving life. And this is the same for the liaison office in over there. Of course, there is much more than that in Michelangelo's fresco, but also in the relation between NATO and the African Union. As for NATO, there is an ongoing political debate. Of course, the focus of NATO is the transatlantic security and specifically the security of the European continent. Why? Because war is back in Europe. Actually, war is back against Europe, against Ukraine, which has been progressing very fast in adopting the transatlantic values. So, as a matter of fact, the last meeting of foreign ministers discussed a lot about the security in Europe, Ukraine, etc. But also they had a specific, let's say, discussion on how to expand and deepen the relationship with the southern neighborhood. And they, let's say, decide to take decision on this matter during the next summit, head of state and heads of governments summit, NATO summit, that is planned for July in Washington. This is very telling because it means that the presidents and the head of government will endorse decision concerning NATO posture vis-à-vis the South. So it's a work in progress. There are different hypotheses on the table, and we will see what will be the outcome. I would say the same is happening for the African Union. Why? Because it's a very complex reality. In the analysis community, we like to talk about a system of systems. Both NATO and the African Union are system of systems, very complex. And we should take, we should acknowledge this reality. So these two realities need to move carefully. Are they converging? I would say yes. Will they deal with additional pragmatic fields of common interest, including energy? I would say yes. It takes time. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think you made a very good point and some opening up for some possible questions about these areas that you say are the potential directions in which the cooperation with the African Union could go. And it's precisely the area where we should go in the discussion, and you should probably address that. Now, one of the things that you mentioned is the convergence, and I see that certainly there is a lot of convergence in terms of energy security and of challenges vis-à-vis what is happening with the war in Ukraine between NATO and the EU. NATO and the EU are on the same page with regard to the threats to energy security and to the challenge that represents the conflict started by Russia by its invasion of Ukraine. Now, looking at that from both the point of view of the EU-African Union relationship, which is your responsibility, because I forgot to mention that Johan van den Berg is the head of the Secretariat of the Africa-EU Energy Partnership. How can you say, what can you say in terms of energy partnership between Africa and the EU? How can this be including also the security perspective and the role of the alliance?
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's lovely to be with you. It's an honor also. I'm going to start with my message because, then if time runs out, then nothing has been lost. So what am I here to tell you? I'm essentially here to tell you that the dystopian and chaotic African energy future as a scenario is a security nightmare to all of you. And that the harmonious and somewhat interdependent and planned African energy future that has already been adopted by all African ministers can be a scenario of dreams. So that essentially is my message. Now, how do I get there? Okay, who are we? I mean, let me first say who am I? I'm South African, so I'm the African in the room. I'm a lawyer by background, worked in climate and energy for 20 years. Africa Energy Partnership is essentially a dialogue forum between Africa and Europe. So we're deeply embedded with the European Commission, African Union Commission, African Union Development Agency. Our other members of our steering group are Italy, Egypt, COMESA, and who did I forget? Germany. And most of our money comes from the European Commission at the moment. This will also change. Let me maybe come back to that and rather go to the slide, which I think is at the heart of all of this. Now, if you read this slide, you should read it from the left to the right, and then it goes incrementally from chaos to order and from sadness to happiness. We know that there's massive energy poverty in Africa. People have already referred to this. I don't have to repeat the numbers. this ultimately leads to instability. It is associated with state failure. It leads to migration. It leads to ripe situations for warfare, for terrorism, for all sorts of things. Where is Africa trying to go? For the last many years, the International Renewable Energy Agency and the International Atomic Energy Agency have been modeling Africa's energy master plan, called the Africa's Single Electricity Market and the Africa Continental Master Plan. This was already finished last year, and it was adopted by all African ministers last year at the so-called STC meeting in Zanzibar. So what I want to tell you is, for the time being, although very few people may know it, the discussion about the energy mix in Africa is over. The decision has already been made. We know where we're wanting to go, and in 2040, if we can follow the plan, which is very difficult, then everybody will have energy. The generation in Africa will be 4 times higher. The emissions will be exactly what they are now, and the GDP will be, I can't remember, maybe triple what it is now. So the plan is there. It envisages a pan-African system that has got power pools that are connected. I think about 65% of the energy would come from renewable. And this is the lowest cost model. So this is not adapted for any climate imperatives. This is the lowest cost model. You can still tweak it to be more climate friendly, but I would say it would be very difficult to tell any African that this is not good enough, essentially dropping energy intensity 4-fold in the next 15 years or so. The cost of this, you'd be surprised to hear, it is about 2/3 of the cost to be interconnected and doing this together as Africa than to go into the baseline and just each do it on their own. Okay? Get economies of scale, you get all sorts of good things happening. So instead of $1.9 trillion, it'll cost $1.3 trillion. What would we get out of this? Because remember, now we're talking about a pan-African system that talks to multilateralism, the international order, rules-based order, neighborliness, all these good things that we're trying to foster in Africa. We would get much higher peace and security, we would get better governance, we would get very serious climate protection, but we would also get interdependence between African countries, which not everybody wants. So where does that put us now as NATO? You want to avoid unrest, war, instability, you want to promote good order. This system has been modeled. It now has to be built. It's always far easier to model something than to build it. So, what can you do? I don't think, you have yes, some very interesting ideas have been mentioned on what you could contribute. I very much like the idea of providing the security to whatever is built. But essentially, there's a very large overlap between your interests and the people who want the energy transition in Africa to happen. So ultimately, it's the same community, as somebody said in the previous group. So if the only thing you do is to encourage your governments and your institutions to support the African energy transition and the plans that have already been adopted, then you are doing a lot. And I would say that, and looking at the theme of today's discussion, what did you say? It was gradual and pragmatic, your collaboration with Africa, and I think as a security organization, this is okay. But I would like to say that in terms of promoting the Pan-African cohesion and bringing the energy that is the glue that will keep it together, gradual and pragmatic will not do it. The horse is running from the stable now. You see it in the Sahel and in other places. So urgency is needed. You hear it in my voice. I think maybe I can save you a minute and stop there and rather elaborate a little bit later. Thanks.
Thank you. You're 1 minute ahead of schedule. Thank you very much. So I will take the opportunity to tell you, are there any ideas about where that $1.3 trillion is going to come from?
Yeah, so I also listened in the previous session about some of the discussions on the financing. So I can tell you a very happy story. When I was still working in South Africa as CEO of the South African Wind Energy Association, in 5 years, when the regulatory regime was right, when it stopped being wrong, South Africa invested about $15 billion in renewable energy in South Africa in 5 years. It's one of the 55 countries in Africa. And all this came from...
And probably the richest.
Yeah, in some ways, the easiest place to do it was the easiest, not now, it was then. But it shows you what private sector finance can be leveraged when you align everything. And I mean, yes, there is still a government liability if the utility stops paying, and this lies on the government's balance sheet, so it's not absent. But with Europe or the international community, the Atlantic Alliance, as you call it, which those countries can do is to bring the support for the government guarantees. And if you can do that, and many other people are working at aligning the regulatory regime, the private sector will fix this.
Yeah. Thank you. But while people in the audience think about the questions that are going to ask, I want to go quickly back to the first two panelists to ask, do you see in terms of energy security what Mr. Vandenberg has outlined in terms of cooperation between African Union, European Union, and NATO, something realistic, possible? And on the same issue, from the point of view of NATO's cooperation with the African Union, do you see this as a potential positive direction in which things could evolve? Who wants to go first?
I can start. Again, NATO is not the EU. We don't do development aid. We don't do economic cooperation. This is not our area of expertise. That said, we can work, and we do work with African nations. Like, for instance, just a couple of years back, we organized this huge exercise in Algeria, where basically we helped train the Algerian army how to protect critical energy infrastructure from terrorist attacks, for instance. We work with African nations on energy projects through the Science for Peace and Security program, which also funds this conference. But looking forward, what I said about the energy transition, and perhaps I need to stress it now, our lives will change radically, okay? Within 25 years, everything will be digitalized, everything will be electrified, everything will be interconnected. You'll have more infrastructure, including undersea cables, more cables carrying electricity, carrying data, and that kind of infrastructure will need to be protected because it is vulnerable and it will remain so. So there are some best practices that are being forged, and perhaps on the longer run, those could be shared and included in the kind of training activities that we pursue with African nations.
Thank you. And from the point of view of cooperation with the African Union?
I would say yes, but.
Okay.
Yes, but. Why but? Because we need to take 2 steps back to see things from the proper distance. Let's look at the sheer dimension of these 2 organizations. So 32 countries on one side, 55 on the other side. Almost 1 billion inhabitants one side, 1.5 billion. But in 2050, it's 2.5 billion. If we look at the geographical extension, well, if we look not only at the picture, but at the movies, so dynamics is also extremely important. So if these 2 organizations converge in order to address common and shared challenges, and energy is definitely one of these, it's positive, no question. And I believe this is an area where these 2 very big organizations definitely can converge. How? So the pragmatic approach. Honestly, NATO is not fit for every kind of business. So honestly, I don't see as a matter of priority NATO troops under NATO flag protecting solar panels somewhere in Africa. This is pretty unlikely in my own opinion. So if we look at the proper, at the topic from the proper distance, yes. If we want to, let's say,
Yeah, okay. It's a question of political will.
Voila.
From both sides.
Definitely, and that's why I mentioned the convergence, which require a reciprocal, let's say, agreement. And please remember the three principle: African ownership, at African Union request. This is the cooperation support from NATO. Why? Because we want definitely to, let's say, endorse and enforce the principle of African solution to African problem.
Of course.
So it's a real partnership. It's not just support, but real partnership means equal partnership.
Very clear, very clear. Okay, so I think we have, you wanted to add something?
Maybe I could do it at the end.
Perhaps we should move and give the possibility to people from the audience to ask questions. Was everything so clear that there's no questions?
I will challenge the room if you let me.
Ambassador.
I have one basic question. Because we turn around the important topic which is at the center of the conference, combining energy security, energy supply, market regulation. But I don't hear much about the actual relationship between the NATO or such an organization and the African Union, because it is good to have what you said is perfectly pertinent. But at the core, as far as I know, but I may be behind, is that there is a military cell from NATO headquarters into the African Union Secretariat, and some kind of agreement to have a civilian representation as well. But I don't know if you have something more to add on that. Perhaps Mr. Grazioso may know something about it.
Yeah, I briefly mentioned this point. So NATO established 10 years ago a liaison office located in Addis Ababa, where there are officers from NATO acting as liaison officers. So basically conveying all the requirements and needs that African Union put forward in order for NATO to address this request. What kind of requests we receive as NATO? We keep on receiving logistics support, requests for logistics support. It was in Somalia, for example, AMISOM, etc. So basically, airlift, sea lift, etc. We are receiving requests for training, and that's why NATO is opening more and more courses, etc. And we are receiving requests to, let's say, support in order to reinforce and enhance African Union capabilities as far as crisis management is concerned. Early warning, standby forces, etc. As for the political side, so to have a political representative side by side with the military liaison office, this is again a work in progress, both in Brussels and in Addis Ababa. There is not a fix yet, and I'm not, let's say, privy with this kind of discussion. As you know, NATO is a very sophisticated structure, so this is not something that we deal with at the local level as we are. But we all know that this is a work in progress. Since 2016, in Warsaw, the summit in Warsaw, NATO decided that improving and deepening cooperation with the African Union was definitely an allied political goal. So we are progressing in this direction. But again, we need to be, let's say, in a coordinated and synchronized with also African Union internal evolution. Let me add something more. We keep on talking about African Union, which is definitely pivotal. But there are also regional economic communities, which are also extremely relevant for understanding how African governance is evolving. And in the case of economic cooperation, including energy sector, economic communities other than African Union are also extremely important and a very important partner, prospective partner for NATO.
Thank you. There is one question there.
I'm Dana Consato. I'm a PhD candidate. So my question is connected to the question of ambassador. And in light of these new African relations based on fairness, is it better to reshape existent international and multilateral arena, or imagine a new type of dialogue based on technological transfer and business, for example? So this is my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is a question addressed to a NATO official, so either of you can take it. Who do you want to address the question?
Another question.
Okay, we'll take another question. Alessandro.
Yes, thank you.
Is that you?
Thank you very much to all the panelists. It was a quite instructive session. I have a specific question for one representative of the only white tribe of Africa, very long history. Seeing how transitions are differently managed. Do you hear me now? Okay.
Are managed.
Seeing how transition are differently managed in different countries, how do you think external institutions, I don't know if more NATO or EU or in synergy, can assist countries in better managing the post-transition phase? Because you see, sometimes you have success stories that are very successful for the time of media attention, and then, well, it's a bit different. Thank you very much, most kind.
More questions? Yes. Here in the front.
I'm Tullio Morganti. I'm a consultant, freelance, with 15 years of experience in Africa, or field work. My question is, how is NATO thinking of tackling the problem of fragility, institutional, economic, military fragility of the African states? Because otherwise we cannot talk about strategies if we don't have a plan, a program to fight or contrast the fragility. Thank you.
Thank you. I think they're all very interesting questions. Would you like to address the question, Julian, that was more oriented towards energy security, please?
Let me try to rebound on a couple of notions that
Please.
were floated. On fragility and the African states, so NATO has DCB packages, defense capacity building packages, tailored specifically for specific partners. The way it works, a partner country, for instance, Algeria, as I mentioned, comes to NATO and is like, could you please help us train our army, our security forces to counter terrorist threats? We say yes. We provide training. This is the kind of support in the military side that we can give. You spoke of fragility. Later this year, I think in May, we will be organizing a very big conference on climate security and Africa and the impact of climate change in the Sahel, in Mauritania, with Mauritanian officials and African officials. What will be the security impact for the Sahel? How can those countries prepare for it? Those are the kind of issues that we're looking at. Now, putting off my NATO hat for a second, I'm very concerned about the energy transition in Africa. Because logically, you would think that even today, Africa should be exporting electricity to Europe. It's the other way around. We today are exporting electricity to Africa. And we in Europe, we are really committed to pursuing the energy transition. And in fact, to use a military example, and this brings the technology element in. 20 years ago, to produce electricity in a military camp, you needed a diesel generator. Today, to produce electricity, you need solar panels and a battery. In 20 years, you will still be able to produce electricity from that solar panel in your military camp, but also produce synthetic fuels from this electricity on the spot. What does it mean? It means that we will need less and less and less fossil fuels. Less oil, less gas. In fact, in 25 years, if you'll be in the oil and gas business, you will be pursuing a very expensive hobby. Everything will be electrified, digitalized, interconnected, more infrastructure, more interconnectors, cables, batteries. This is where we're going.
Thank you. You have something to say about the question on transitions?
So I suspect the question on transition was a political question on how did it go so well and then so badly in South Africa. This is maybe not something I have time for, but I'm happy to take it offline with you. I would prefer to make maybe one or two other closing remarks, if I may.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about you?
Oh, just few words.
I think there's probably need for, and there is already a reflection on both fragility and the question of transitions. NATO has had a role in Europe in terms of transitions of post-conflict countries, but for instance in the Balkans. So is there any reflections in the South Hub to how to use that experience in some, potentially in some African countries?
There is a key word, that is listening. Listening to understand. Because we tend to think that we have the solution for their problem, which is not true. So we need, first of all, to listen and to understand their perspective, their ideas and their options for solutions. How can we address these problems? NATO cannot do everything, cannot do a lot. Multidimensional fragility is the concern with the capital C. NATO provides support, for example, in the education field. We have the honor to have the commander of NATO Defense College. NATO Defense College is, please, General, correct me, is delivering education training to the cream of the cream. I mean, the elite of staff officers, but also government officials from several partners and friendly countries in the South, not only in Africa. This is an example. As for the hub, we are regularly working with civil society, with scholars, with stakeholders to understand from their words, from their knowledge, which are their priorities. We are not giving solution, but we are offering them, actually we are taking advantage of their knowledge and expertise to improve our understanding and to some extent to contribute to NATO debate, a debate able to take into consideration which are the priorities and the problems and the issues in the South. This is what NATO is doing right now. And then, again, political debate is ongoing for a wider NATO role in the wider South. But we all know that there are also other compelling priorities for an alliance which is still focused on the security and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area. This is a fact.
One question, and it's a personal curiosity, is when I was working for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and Ambassador Minutorizzo was one of the great, promoter of that policy. There existed two types of partnerships. One was the Mediterranean Dialogue, the other was the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. And so, is there any convergence or coordination within the NATO South Hub on these different policies and partnerships, you know, both at multilateral level and individual level, meaning NATO +1.
This is not a matter that the hub is directly involved in. Partnerships are let's say, discussed and operated in Brussels at HQ level, international staff, and also international military staff. The hub is an entity with a strategic impact, but not without a direct political role in dealing with formal partnerships.
Okay.
And I wish to remember that there are permanent representatives from NATO partners in Brussels. This is why Brussels is where this matter is.
Thank you. I think there is a little time for one final word from each one of you. So I will start with Mr. Van den Berg, who has less opportunity to talk.
Sure.
Please.
Yeah, and again, thank you for having been here. I found it extremely interesting. Just a few remarks. The one is, I heard in many of the speakers today a sort of an assumption that fossil fuels is really the game and the renewables are coming. And I'd like to urge you to be very cautious with this assumption. It's been exponential in the change. I think there's been one person in the history that has overestimated the growth in renewable energy, and everybody else has underestimated it. So it's the reality. Never mind about this, what the science tells us we have to do for climate change. The technology is upon us and growing exponentially. So it was said 20 years. I don't know that it'll even be 20 years. It'll be less than that. So this is changing. And the costs already are dramatically in the favor of renewable energy. When you add the storage, well, then maybe it's a little bit more even. Maybe my last point is to say that, you know, as somebody who's not on the inside of NATO, I look at you, I have great admiration for the work you do. I see you as an entity that guards against existential threat. And you have red lines, and you say if somebody crosses that red line, very bad things will happen to them. Now, there are existential threats that go well beyond security, and climate is one of them. You are not set up to hold guns towards the climate threat, but in my view, it would be great if you could keep your eye on that threat and say, well, if nobody's taking care of it, what is it that we can do? What persuasion can we put towards our governments and other institutions? Because ultimately, it's all the same group of people trying to do the good things. Thank you.
Thank you. Julian, final word?
Yes, 2 points, if I may. I painted a fairly grim picture, so I'd like to put some optimism back in the room. If I look at the technologies used by the military, I mentioned solar panels and camps deployable. Those things are called microgrids. Basically, solar panels connected to a battery stores the energy. And you don't need a national grid connected to it for it to operate. It can work independently. So I personally think, previously we mentioned that in the previous session, panelists mentioned that there is a problem with access to energy in Africa. That could be part of the answer, such technologies, and they're like developing very quickly currently. Some of them actually, of those microgrids, the name can be very misleading, are so big that they can power up a whole city of 1 million people for 30 days. Now, secondly, Africa, yes, has lots of oil and gas, but critically, it has a lot of critical minerals and rare earths that will be indispensable for the energy transition. And I kept on repeating myself how committed and decided we are in Europe and North America to go into that direction. So in a way, the continent has all it needs to make it a success story and really turn it into its favor. But policymakers inside African nations also need to be cautious, because other countries, I'll refrain from naming them, come with suitcases full of cash, buy mines where those elements are produced, refine it back home, convert them to products which are then being sold on global markets. So again, I think that there is a lot of hope for Africa. It just requires a lot of wisdom and certainly coordination.
Thank you. Very quickly, final word from you.
One
Andrea?
simple word, combined word, long term. We often fail to understand the relevance of long-term dynamics. And when we deal with Africa, dynamics are very, very important in the medium to long term. So in order to define solutions or at least take decision, we have to look forward in the long term.
Okay, and with a look at the long run, I think we have no time for anything more. I invite you all to join us for a coffee break before we start the final session. Thank you to our panelists.